All right, so get ready because we're diving into a world of white nights and some pretty intense emotions. We're taking a deep dive into Fyodor Dostoevsky's White Nights. It's a story that's really kind of as unique as its setting.
Yeah, this one is really special. The White Nights are, they're actually referring to a real thing that happens in St. Petersburg. During the summer solstice, the twilight lingers almost all night long, and it's this really ethereal atmosphere, and it really sets the stage perfectly for this emotional journey that Dostoevsky is taking us on.
So this is an early Dostoevsky, right? This is 1848.
1848.
But even in this early work, we can already see like the genius that would just blossom later on in his masterpieces. And we get to see this whole story through the eyes of an unnamed narrator. He's kind of a quirky character, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. And that's actually a really clever move by Dostoevsky, limiting us to just the narrator's perspective. It just pulls us right into his intense loneliness and, that longing for connection. It really makes you think about, have you ever felt that kind of isolation, even when you're surrounded by people? That's the feeling that Dostoevsky captures so well.
It's palpable from the very first night of the story.
Yeah.
And it's almost funny, actually, how abandoned the narrator feels when all the other people leave the city for the summer holidays. Like, he even starts talking to buildings as if they're keeping him company.
Well, that's what we call personification. And Dostoevsky uses it brilliantly to highlight the narrator's alienation. He is an outsider, even when he's in his own city. And this is also where we start to see that the narrator struggles with change.
You mean like when he gets all upset that that pink house was painted yellow? I'll admit I chuckled at that part.
Yeah, it is amusing, but it reveals something a little bit deeper about him. He clings to routine, to what's familiar, and even the smallest change just kind of throws him off balance. But then this chance encounter kind of shakes things up for him. So picture this. Our lonely narrator is wandering along the canal late one night, and he sees this young woman. Her name is Nástenka. She's in tears.
Ah, Nástenka. Now, she is a fascinating character. But before we get into that relationship, tell me, how does Dostoevsky just pull us into the scene so effectively?
Well, he's a master of these emotionally charged encounters. It's that immediacy, that rawness in his writing, and you feel the narrator's empathy for Nástenka, his almost instinctive desire to help her. And then, just as things start getting interesting, this drunk gentleman, he tries to accost Nástenka.
And our shy, unassuming narrator, he suddenly turns into, like, a knight in shining armor. It's such a twist.
Exactly. It's a brilliant contrast to his usual awkwardness, especially around women. But Nastenka's vulnerability, it seems to awaken this hidden boldness in him.
And that's how this unusual connection begins. And then they meet again the next night. And Nástenka, with this playful spirit, she demands to hear his life story.
And Nastenka is quite a character, too. She's full of life. She's longing for connection, but she's stuck in this really stifling life. She lives with her blind and controlling grandmother.
Which makes it all the more understandable why she's drawn to our narrator, because he describes himself as a dreamer. And I have to say, when I was reading his description, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so relatable. Those elaborate daydreams, that desire to just escape reality. Who hasn't been there?
He paints such a vivid portrait of the dreamer type, someone who lives so richly in their imagination that reality just pales in comparison. And Dostoevsky's genius is that he captures both the joy and the sorrow of this kind of existence. There's a reason that image of the startled kitten that he uses to describe a dreamer, it just sticks with you.
It's so poignant, isn't it? You see that allure and the danger of living in a fantasy world. But speaking of fantasies, Nástenka reveals her own dreams, too. It's a real mix of humor and pathos, especially her stories about being literally tethered to her grandmother.
Oh, yeah. Her grandmother, while she's kind of comical, actually represents a very real constraint on Nástenka's freedom. You can really sense how she yearns to break free, to experience life on her own terms. And then a new character enters the scene. The lodger.
Oh, yes, the lodger. Their connection is fascinating. It's fueled by their shared love of literature. Walter Scott, Pushkin, talk about a recipe for romance.
Literature acts as a bridge between them, creating this sense of intimacy and understanding. It's like they've found kindred spirits in each other.
But of course, there's a catch. The lodger eventually leaves for Moscow. He promises to return in a year and potentially marry Nástenka. So we've got some high stakes and lots of uncertainty here.
This is where Dostoevsky starts to build that suspense. He puts Nástenka in this really vulnerable position. She's clinging to hope while battling this fear of being let down.
And then we fast forward to the final night of their encounters. Nástenka is totally on edge. She's waiting for a letter from the lodger. And it never comes. I could feel her disappointment just through the pages.
Dostoevsky takes us on that emotional roller coaster right along with Nástenka. The hope, the anticipation, and then that crushing realization that her dreams, they might just be slipping away.
And it's in the midst of all this emotional turmoil
Hmm.
that the narrator confesses his feelings for Nástenka. That's a pretty bold move, considering all that she's going through.
It is a pivotal moment, isn't it? And it's so complex. Even as he's declaring his love, he acknowledges his own, he calls it his egoism. He knows that he's stepping into a really delicate situation. And Nastenka's reaction is just a complete mix of emotions, heartbreak over the lodger and then this sudden outpouring of affection from the narrator.
So how does Dostoevsky resolve this whole tangled web of emotions? What becomes of Nástenka and the narrator?
It's just as nuanced as the rest of the story. Nastenka, at first, she's devastated by the lodger's silence, but then she kind of hints that she might actually reciprocate the narrator's feelings. It's a bittersweet moment, right?
It really is bittersweet. Like you're left wondering, is this a happy ending? Or is it just like a pause before reality sets in again?
That's Dostoevsky for you. He never shies away from the messy and, the contradictory nature of human emotions. And he leaves us really pondering what true happiness might look like for these characters. And, this story, it isn't just about romantic love. It's about that universal yearning for connection in a world that can sometimes feel so isolating.
I think anyone who's ever felt like an outsider, they can really relate to the narrator's loneliness. But like you said, the story goes so much deeper than that. It explores those really fundamental questions about, what genuine connection even means.
Yeah, like it makes you ask yourself, is it about sharing those fantasies? Or about accepting each other's flaws? Is it about finding someone who sees the world in the same way you do? White Nights doesn't really give us easy answers, but it definitely sparks those reflections on our own experiences with love, with friendship, and just that feeling of belonging.
And talking about those shared fantasies, one of the things that really stood out to me was how powerfully Dostoevsky portrays that allure of dreams. When the narrator describes his imaginary adventures, they're so vivid, you get lost in them right along with him.
He really understands the power of escapism, especially for someone like the narrator. Dreams give him that refuge from the ordinary.
Yeah.
They're a chance to experience all these intense emotions, these heroic feats, all within the safety of his own mind.
And it's not just him. Nástenka, she gets caught up in these fantasies too, like that dream of marrying a Chinese prince. It's as if both characters are searching for something bigger than their everyday lives.
What Dostoevsky is showing us is that dreams, they can inspire us, but they can also delude us. They can offer a sense of solace and possibility, but they can also prevent us from engaging with the real world and forming real connections.
So it's about finding a balance, like that sweet spot between those dreams and the real world of relationship.
Exactly. And Dostoevsky illustrates that tension perfectly. He shows us how the narrator's dreams, while they start as this source of joy, eventually they lead to isolation and even despair.
You start to think about the setting too, St. Petersburg, with those ethereal white nights, that almost dreamlike atmosphere. It plays a big role in all of this.
It's so fascinating how Dostoevsky connects the city itself to the theme of dreams. St. Petersburg becomes this dreamscape. He blurs the lines between fantasy and reality. It almost encourages the narrator's escapism. And for Nástenka, confined by her grandmother, those dreams and romantic illusions, they're even more tempting.
And this is where Dostoevsky's genius really shines through. He's not just telling a simple love story. He's using these characters to explore universal themes of loneliness, longing, and that human need for connection.
Absolutely. And speaking of connection, we should talk about the lodger. He's a pivotal character, even though we only experience him through what the narrator and Nástenka tell us.
He almost feels like this symbol, this unattainable ideal that Nástenka fixates on. And by keeping him off stage, it's like Dostoevsky's making us focus on the impact of his absence.
Yeah, it's a really interesting choice. In a traditional romance, he'd be the hero, sweeping her off her feet. But White Nights doesn't follow those rules.
It's more realistic, in a way. The lodger's absence, it creates this void that the narrator tries to fill. But even his love for Nástenka, it has this undercurrent of melancholy, this unrequited longing.
Dostoevsky really explores the complexities of love in this story. The way it can be selfless and selfish, hopeful and heartbreaking, all at the same time.
And nowhere is that more evident than on that final night.
Yeah.
That scene where Nástenka is just waiting for that letter, the tension, the anticipation, it's palpable.
Dostoevsky, he's a master of suspense. He uses the ticking clock, Nástenka's anxiety, to create this almost unbearable sense of dread. And when the letter doesn't arrive, You just feel the weight of her despair.
And that's when the narrator confesses his feelings. This bold move, right? Especially considering how fragile Nástenka is in that moment.
But there's also a genuine tenderness in his confession. Even knowing that his love might not be fully returned, he can't help but express it. He's drawn to her vulnerability. He wants to comfort her.
Do you think he's being selfish or selfless? It's just such a complicated mix of emotions.
I think it's both, wouldn't you say? He recognizes his own, egoism that's driven by his own unrequited longing. But there's real compassion there, too, that willingness to love her, even if she can't love him back in the same way.
It's a good reminder that love often involves sacrifice, accepting imperfections.
Exactly. And that brings us to the ending. Nástenka, she's still heartbroken about the lodger, but she hints that she might have feelings for the narrator. It's a glimmer of hope, but there's also a sense of inevitability.
Inevitability, what do you mean?
Well, think about her situation. She's vulnerable, right? She's looking for comfort after being rejected. It's only natural to want affection, but does that mean she really loves the narrator?
So you're saying maybe it's more of a consolation prize than real love?
It's not that simple. Dostoevsky, like always, he leaves the ending open to our interpretation.
So some people might see it as this hopeful beginning, a chance for a different kind of happiness, while others might think, this is just going to lead to more heartbreak.
Exactly. Dostoevsky doesn't give us those neat and tidy resolutions that you see in typical romances. He gives us ambiguity, which is way more like real-life relationships.
So it's really up to the reader to decide whether they see that glimmer of hope or that looming sense of disillusionment.
Precisely. And that's what makes White Night so thought-provoking. It asks those huge questions about love, about dreams, about the human search for connection. But it doesn't give us those easy answers.
It's like Dostoevsky is saying, hey, life is messy, and love doesn't always follow the rules. But even in that mess, there's beauty and maybe, just maybe, a glimmer of hope. As we've been talking about all these complexities in the story, it makes me think about how Dostoevsky uses light and darkness to really reflect the characters' inner worlds. Those white nights where the sun barely even sets, it creates this almost surreal atmosphere.
Yeah, it's such a brilliant literary device. Those white nights, they mirror the narrator's heightened emotions, that sense of hope and possibility. But at the same time, there's this subtle foreshadowing, too. Just like the sun has to eventually set, even in St. Petersburg, those moments of joy and connection, they can fade, too.
And then you have this stark contrast with the darkness that surrounds Nástenka, being trapped in that house with her grandmother.
Exactly. The darkness, it symbolizes her confinement, physically and emotionally. She's yearning for light, for freedom, for a love that can really illuminate her life.
Which makes the arrival of the lodger so significant. He's like this sudden burst of light, bringing excitement and all these possibilities into her life.
He represents that romantic ideal that she's always dreamed of. But Dostoevsky's really clever because he hints at the danger of those expectations. I mean, even sunlight, it can be blinding, right?
And then when those hopes are dashed, when the lodger doesn't come back, it's like someone just turned off the lights. It leaves Nástenka in total despair.
It's this harsh reminder that reality, it rarely lives up to our romanticized expectations. And it's in those moments of darkness, when those illusions are shattered, that Dostoevsky really shows us the depth of his characters.
And that's when the narrator steps in. It's like he's offering his own kind of light. Maybe a quieter, less dazzling light, but one that's grounded in real affection and compassion.
That's really the heart of White Nights, wouldn't you say? This testament to the power of hope, even when you're faced with disappointment and unrequited love. The narrator, even though he's lonely himself, he chooses to offer Nástenka that comfort and support.
Which brings us back to that ending. It's so ambiguous. Do you think there's any chance of real happiness for them? Or is their whole relationship just flawed from the very beginning?
Dostoevsky, like always, wants us to think about that. Some readers might look at Nástenka, hesitantly accepting the narrator's love as a good sign. Maybe they can create their own version of White Nights together, finding solace and strength in each other.
I like that interpretation. But I could also see how people might see their relationship as just this fragile thing, born out of desperation and that need to just fill a void.
Exactly. And that's why White Nights is such a powerful and thought-provoking story. Dostoevsky isn't giving us simple answers. He's showing us the complexity of love and relationships, how they don't always follow a straight path.
It's like he's holding up a mirror to us and asking, what would you do? How would you deal with all these messy emotions? What kind of compromises would you make for connection and happiness?
I think so too. He really makes us think about these questions. And that's why White Nights still resonates with readers. It speaks to that universal human experience of longing, of disappointment, and the search for meaning and connection.
It reminds us that even in the darkest times, even when our dreams are shattered, there's always that flicker of hope, that spark of human connection that can light our way.
That's a great way to put it. And for anyone who wants to keep exploring these themes, I highly recommend checking out some of Dostoevsky's other works, Notes from Underground or Crime and Punishment. They offer even more insights into the human mind and those moral dilemmas that we all struggle with.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into White Nights. We hope you've enjoyed it and that it's given you something to think about as you navigate your own lives and relationships.